Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. Matt Prehm and Erik Skopil on this Monday edition of the show. It's a mailbag. Oregon's coming off I'll call it a blowout and a good performance. 34-13 win at UCLA, a Rose Bowl crowd that was 44,000. I'm not sure if it was that way, but it felt like at least a third of the stadium was Duck fans. There were a lot there. It was a good week, and there's probably going to be a lot to talk about from that week, from the first 4 games of the season, and then what's to come this week as well on the pod.
Here's a question that's not in the mailbag, but Matt, how are you feeling after the road trip down to Pasadena? You're the only one that went this time.
Yeah, I mean, Big Ten treks are difficult, and apparently even on the West Coast, the league needed to make it hard on us media members. I mean, hard on fans in general. I mean, 8 p.m. kickoffs are tough. There was definitely a point where UCLA was, I think, trailing by 15 points, and people were leaving the stadium, in part because of how poor UCLA was playing, but also because it was, it's 10:15. We probably should get out of here, like to beat traffic if we want to be home by midnight. It's brutal. It sucks, especially when you have a 7:30 a.m. flight the next morning. So yeah, I am running on just a couple hours of sleep, even a Monday later, after job duties, parental duties on Sunday. But yeah, trip was fine. It was nice to be in warm weather. I hate LA traffic. Every time I go there, I'm okay to live in a smaller town like Eugene. But I'll be honest, it wasn't as glamorous as previous LA trips, just because you sat in a hotel and then we're up really late, and then press box got closed, and these are problems that people don't care about.
No, the good news is Matt made it back, and
yes.
we're starting another week. They just roll it over, and this week is Michigan State. Surprisingly, and maybe not surprisingly, coming out of that game, there's no Michigan State questions on this show. It's all Oregon review, kind of getting into some stuff here. So we'll start with the question I thought was a good one, just to kind of maybe do a little temperature check here. This is from @BigDuckEnergy. What is an area on offense and on defense that needs to be solidified or improved in order to compete with the top teams? #Autzen Audibles. I thought this was just a good one to kind of get a feel for kind of where we think some things need to change or get better on offense and defense. Coming out of this one, there's way more on offense to talk about. I think the run game played a lot better in Corvallis than what we saw this last game. I think in watching the game again, I was actually more impressed than I thought I'd be with some of the interior blocking in terms of run plays. It felt like at times that there were some pretty good size holes that Jordan James was able to wiggle through. Still managed 100 yards on about 6 yards per carry. I thought that was totally fine. But in general, I think you're going to want to be able to rely on this aspect, especially when you get into Big Ten play against the top teams. And I guess really the top teams are but Ohio State and Michigan at this point. Illinois maybe
Penn State.
But they're definitely. I'm just saying on Oregon's schedule.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay.
Oregon won't play them unless they get to the conference championship game, and maybe that will be the matchup. If they beat Ohio State, there's a good chance that maybe that's what happens. But I do think you want to see an uptick there, and I actually thought on rewatch the part that was, and this is kind of an extension of the run game, but on the screen passes, the perimeter blocking was not very good at all. I thought on Saturday, I thought there was some receivers and tight ends and even some offensive linemen on some sequences where they tried to get everybody out there that kind of just missed blocks. And that was probably a point of some frustration of like, if you're going to be throwing screen passes, you better be getting 5 to 6 yards for screen pass. And at times you were losing yards or negligible gains. So I think on offense, it's you'd like to see more consistency in terms of chunk plays. You'd like to see Jordan James run for more than a 20-yard gain. That'd be great. I think his season long is 16. But I also think on the perimeter, I think you just in general want to see a little better blocking in run situations and screen situations. And again, I think the screen game is at this point kind of an extension of the run game and kind of just like an off tackle play. So those would be the two things on offense for me. I think the pass game, and we got a lot of questions here about a couple specific players, and one of them is Evan Stewart, and we'll get to that at the end. I think the pass game is pretty darn healthy right now. I think the run game is on offense the area that you want to improve. And I don't know. Why don't I throw it to you, Matt, for offensive improvements, and then we'll do defense later.
I think for me, it's the run game. I mean, it's the lowest yard per carry average, at least through 2016. 4.32 yards right now. And that's like just at the bottom half of the middle of the road of the entire country at this level. They're 76th nationally at 4.32 yards per carry. I think everything has been like hard for Jordan James. He's looked good, but there hasn't been a game where the run game has just created massive holes and you walked out of that being like, man, like they ran for 333 yards because this other team just could not stop them. There were holes everywhere. It didn't matter who was running the football. You or I could have picked up 7 yards with the holes that they were creating. Like we've never had that type of performance yet from Oregon's offensive line in the run game. Everything has just been difficult. And to your point, like Jordan James' longest run, did you say 20 yards? Like that doesn't surprise me.
2 runs this year of 16. Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's tiny. And I don't think to Jared's point, he brought up last week, or maybe it was after the game. I don't know when it was, but he brought up Bucky and how Bucky could kind of create openings and create, turn a 7-yard run into a 19-yard run, or a 1-yard run into a 12-yard run because of his shiftiness. And I agree with that. But I don't think even Bucky right now would be having the level of success that he had the previous 2 seasons, just because it's so hard every single time to have to create 4 or 5 yards on your own every time. And that feels like what Jordan James and to an extent Noah Whittington is having to do running the football. So I think the biggest surprise has been just the lack of ease isn't the right word, but like it's just always been the bread and butter of an Oregon football team, whether it was under Chip Kelly and Mark Helfrich, and even in the year of Willie Taggart, certainly in the Mario Cristobal years, and it's continued in Dan Lanning's era, where it's like, hey, we're going to run the football, and we know on average the percentages are going to say we're going to get 5.5, 6 yards a carry every time. And that's just not the case this season. It's interesting. It's weird. I think sacks from Dylan Gabriel probably played a little bit of a role into that right now because the sample size is still relatively smaller than a whole season. But I also think, like to your point too, like the screen game is basically an extension, and that doesn't factor in here. Tez Johnson, I mean, against UCLA, that was everything that they did, like screens and short passes, and that's essentially a run play. But nonetheless, like their run game and being what it is, it's not concerning, but it's also not good enough.
It's interesting talking about the run game and the components because the stats are down. The part that's interesting is if you look at it like this: if in a run offense you have a quarterback who might run, you have a primary running back, and then you have supplementary running backs. Based upon production, Jordan James is actually outproducing what Bucky Irving did the last 2 years on a per game basis, and is basically even in terms of a yards per carry basis. So it's like you're getting maybe, and I'm not saying Bucky and Jordan are the same player. I think they're different players. I think they're probably actually kind of on similar levels in terms of talent, but maybe not quite the same strengths and weaknesses. And if we want to get into a breakdown of that, we can. But the difference is Dylan Gabriel's legs are being utilized almost exclusively on scrambles. The one time they've had like a real designed run play was a 54-yard touchdown. I think his legs could help kind of up some of this and improve some of the numbers. And then the second part, and the most glaring part to me, is the supplementary running backs are nowhere near. Like Noah Whittington, I guess we'll throw Jaden Lamar, even though he barely plays, into this kind of group. They're just not producing at a very good level. I mean, this has been a tough year for Noah for whatever reason. And then if you look at the past seasons, like In 2022, Noah Whittington was the guy averaging over 6 yards per carry, running for 700 yards that season. And then last year, it was Jordan James filling in that same spot. So I do think part of it is like, it feels like there's one running back who runs with success and they don't use the quarterback's legs very often. And I think the combination of that is kind of sinking some of this from my perspective, at least.
What are your thoughts on this like narrative of Evan Stewart force feeding the ball? Like,
that's a question at the end. Do you want to get into that right now?
No, let's save it.
We can. No, it's on the list.
Let's save it just because I felt like we've seen a lot of screen passes with Evan Stewart too. And that's the only reason why I kind of brought it up. Like, I don't know. Like I think Oregon's playmakers are so dynamic. This is where I was wanting to keep it with the running back question though. Yeah. I think Oregon's dynamics at receiver is they're better than they were last year with even with Troy Franklin. I think the big play ability is as good as it's been probably in a long time, if not ever, at Oregon in the modern era of football, at the receiver position. And the stats might not show. They may not have two guys that go over 1,000 yards receiving this season. I thought they were going to. I thought Evan Stewart was going to be one of those guys. But I think the depth and the playmaking ability and the home run threat that this unit has, it's seeping away a little bit of the attention that would normally be given to the run game. Because, hey, like, Noah Whittington's not as good as – I don't know if not as good, but he's not back to what he was pre-injury.
Yeah, he's at least not producing. Exactly.
Yeah, production wise. Jordan James is doing a good job, but Jaden Lamar is very clear that Jaden Lamar as the third back is not equal to Jordan James, the third back, in 2022 or in 2023, pre-Whittington injury. So they really only have one guy producing at a level that was expected. Whittington plays, but he doesn't play a ton. And I just feel like, maybe they also say like, hey, we're not really executing a high level run game wise. Let's essentially run the ball to screens and utilize where our playmakers are on this team this season and at receiver. And that's kind of taken away some of the success of the running backs. I just think that they're playing into their strengths. It goes with what Dan Lanning said Saturday night. Like, they didn't want to run straight at UCLA's defensive tackle. They wanted to make some other guys have to tackle, and that's why they were out on the perimeter so much.
Yeah, and if they are going to operate that way, the blocking needs to be better on the perimeter.
Yes, okay. And that's also what he said.
Yeah, defense. Shorter list coming out of that last game. I thought that was the best defensive performance of the season by a wide margin, and I think it stacks up statistically, at least, with one of the best since Dan Lanning's got here. I thought that they were really, really consistently good. If we're going to get real, because at this point, this is what we're going to do. We're going to kind of get into some stuff that's not really a huge error, or like an area of concern, I should say, but an area where it's like, okay, well, maybe it's not as good as the rest. I would say Oregon, when they do get gashed on the ground, it seems like a lot of the time it's linebackers not being in the right spot, or just not, or getting washed out of the play, or anticipating wrong, or being a step slow. And even against UCLA, there were 47 total rush yards in that game. No one's suggesting Oregon got gashed on the ground, but there were two kind of long-ish rushes. TJ Harden actually had a longer run than any run Jordan James has had all season in that third quarter. Both of those plays, it was a case of a linebacker, in part, right? Because it's not just on one person. But I think if the linebacker had been able to shed the block by the pulling guard on both of those, there's a chance that those don't go for big gains. So again, we're talking about real small things here, because I think the defense is awesome. But that's just a thing I've kind of noticed, being when we do see issues in the run game defensively, it seems like it's kind of primarily those guys. So that's what I came up with. Did you have, I guess, third down defense maybe at times has been kind of iffy getting off the field, but those would be the two things off the top of my head.
It's tough to find like glaring concerns considering the way they've played the last 2 weeks. I guess maybe if we want to really be nitpicky, third down conversions, even though against UCLA they could not really do anything on third down. I think they were like 1 of 11 in the first half on third downs, or 2. I think they had 2 in that first drive. But
Matt, they were 1 for 10 for the game on third.
Really, 1 for 10?
I guess the penalty didn't count because there was the 2 longer ones in the first drive, but 1 for 10.
Okay, so like maybe it's getting off the field. When you have opportunities, but it really feels like we're being super nitpicky. And I think that there's maybe if we want to find something like UCLA kind of picked on Nico Reed a little bit at times. Dante Manning really wasn't out there a bunch in that game. I think, and some of this is going to be solved by simply guys getting healthier. Like Bryce Betcher, for an example. Okay, like this dude's playing really good. He is Oregon's best linebacker through 4 games this season, in my opinion. His production is high. His stats are high. He's starting to produce at a high level. He's everywhere on the field. He's definitely one of the emotional leaders of this team. He's a guy that just when he's in position, he makes the play. But he's also like your 3rd or 4th best athlete at the position. And when you're going to play better teams, we've seen it here and there. It hasn't happened a bunch yet because really, honestly, they haven't played uber talented offensive teams through the first 4 games of the season, Boise State being the toughest one.
Yeah.
Teams pick at him at times, and he gets in some situations where it's just not an advantageous situation for him to be in. And as you're going to play these better teams, it's going to be harder and harder for him to be on the field and still bring the level of production that he's doing right now against elite competition. And I think it's not a surprise that as Jeffrey Bossa got more and more snaps this season, and this past week playing a bunch and landing post game saying like, hey, he was all over the place. He had his first week of real full prep and it showed on the game. Like that they're going to be able to mix and match more. We won't see Bryce Betcher out there having to be in some difficult situations for him in coverage or, trying to chase down blocks because the speed and the better athletes at linebacker, Bossa and Jacobs, will be healthy and will be playing more. And you won't have that as much. I think at corner, like the Florence thing is going to start showing a little bit, not having him available. And the first chance we'll see it is against Ohio State. We'll see what happens with Nico Reed and Dante Manning. I mean, Jabbar Muhammad is unbelievably good.
Yes.
And it's a huge luxury to be able to say like, hey, like you don't have to worry about wherever he is at on the field because he's got it covered. Like teams aren't like the bad teams, they aren't even going to throw his way. The good teams, they're gonna be, hey, like let's test him a little bit, but we got to be really cautious about what we throw here. Let's respect the opponent a little bit. Ohio State and their guys will probably still be full go, but that's just going to be elite on elite, and that's what you want. Those are fun matchups to watch. Opposite Jabbar Muhammad, like against a team like Ohio State, like they're gonna go out, they're gonna show respect to the Muhammad and also say like, hey, we think we have huge advantages over here with Nico Reed and Dante Manning having to cover these other 2 guys, whoever they may be, depending on who Jabbar Muhammad's matched up with. That's where I'm maybe we're trying to find some concerns here is like against some of these lesser talented teams, some inefficiencies are being masked, but against the elite team like Ohio State, when they show up, like you need to be all hands on deck. I'm a little concerned about like the other corner opposite Muhammad. I'm a little concerned about, can Bossa or can Betcher hang with the backs at Ohio State? Can he? Because we saw what Janty did. Like, and Janty may be the best player in the country, but he was unbelievably good against Oregon, and you need your best talent there. But all that long-winded answer, like I feel like we're being really nitpicky because we're playing really good.
No, I'm happy you brought up the corner part. I think Nico and Dante have played pretty solid. I know the question at the end about Nico. It's funny, the 2 people were wanting to talk about, and there's questions in the second half about Evan Stewart and Nico Reed. Those seem to be, we had multiple questions about both guys. I think Nico's played pretty well. I thought he was okay against UCLA, maybe his worst game. The snap counts were actually, we'll get to this later, actually pretty close between Nico and Dante. I think it gets confusing because their numbers look similar. I think you're 100% right, though, Matt, that when it's Emeka Egbuka on one side and Jeremiah Smith on the other for Ohio State, those are two guys who are going to be probably top 20 draft picks when they go. Maybe in Jeremiah Smith's case, in particular, quite a bit higher. You could tell me that Egbuka is going to be a top 10 guy or something as well. I wouldn't push back. I think this is elite talent. I think they're going to go at Jabbar Muhammad in this game. I think they're going to just test everybody. But that will be, to your point about masking some of these inefficiencies. There might not be many teams on the schedule this year that have the receiver talent to beat Oregon's corners with regularity on like one-on-one matchups. Ohio State absolutely does, and that's going to be something we'll be talking about, I guarantee it, in the lead up to that game of, hey, so far through the season, maybe nobody's thrown for more than a couple hundred yards, and there's, the opposing quarterbacks are below 50% or whatever. But this pass attack is very different, and the guys on the outside in this game pose problems that the players we've seen so far, like answer this, Matt, like who's the best receiver Oregon's played this year? Is it Trent Walker?
Maybe. I mean, J. Michael Studevant from UCLA is really
Rico Flores is a guy that I like,
but the problem is like their offensive line was so bad that Garbers didn't have time to have an opportunity to get them the ball. So yeah, it might be Trent Walker, Morgan State. Like what?
Yep. All right. We spent 22 minutes on this question, so let's not spend 22 minutes on this next one. But let's get to number 2 from at Grizzle Muffin. Great name. Simply put, has Oregon strung together one full quarter of solid play in all facets of the game this year? My opinion is no, and it's starting to be a cause for concern, especially with Ohio State in 2 weeks. Hashtag Autzen Audibles. I think they played 3 solid quarters, maybe 4. Now, if it's without a single mistake and totally perfect, the answer is probably no. But I wrote down, they had a really good 4-quarter stretch from the second half in Corvallis to the first half in UCLA, really up until that Brian Addison pick. And here are the splits. Okay, third quarter in Corvallis, outscored him 10-0, outgained him 198-13. I think that's a pretty dominant quarter against any competition. You take that. You outscored, they didn't get on the board. You got 185 more yards from scrimmage in a quarter. Fourth quarter in Corvallis, outscored him 17-0, outgained him 131-78. You remember those 78 yards? A lot of that was against backups. Okay. First quarter against UCLA, 7-3, not as decisive on the scoreboard, but 129-57 in terms of the yardage. So again, a lot more yards. And then the second quarter against UCLA was going to be the best quarter of the season by a mile. They could have finished that drive and it would be a 24-0, 175 to -3 yards split. Instead, it's 21-7, 175 -3. If you want to just eliminate this from being a solid quarter, you can because of the Brian Addison play. I think that would be silly because outscoring a team like that and outgaining them by 180 yards again is really impressive. So no, I think that 4 quarters there, and again, if you do like the cumulatives on that, over those 4 quarters, they outscored their opponents like 55-10 and outgained them. I didn't actually add this up. I wish I had. I don't know what that is. Opponents have gained maybe 130 yards, and Oregon's gained 500, 600 yards, something like that. So you run through all this and you go there was a 4-quarter stretch there that was really, really dominant. If that's a single game, you'd come out and say, oh, hallelujah, here we are. That's really, really awesome. But I understand the point of I don't know if I would say they played a full game of solid play because I think each of these last 2 weeks, a couple quarters on, a couple quarters off. First half in Corvallis, offense was awesome. The defense was kind of iffy at times. Second half, I thought everything was great. I think that was your best half of football. First half or second half against, I guess, UCLA, the defense was great. Offense wasn't very good. But I just think in general, I would push back on a full quarter because I think they've probably played 3 or 4 that have been really, really solid in my mind. But have they played a full game? I think the answer to that is probably no, even though the game in Corvallis was was really close to that, if not for a couple of Oregon State drives that went for points in the first half.
I think if we look at simply one quarter, I mean, look at the second quarter against UCLA. I know it ended in just bad fashion with a pick six, but Oregon scored 21 points. They had 175 yards of offense. They had just one penalty. They had 8 first downs. They played just 27 plays in that game. They averaged 6.5 yards per play. UCLA had 7 points. Granted, it was a pick six, okay? But they had negative 3 yards in that quarter against Oregon in the second quarter. Like, if we want to look at, like, has this team played a full quarter of football? The last game, we saw it, second quarter. Oregon is allowed to make mistakes at times. Now, granted, the mistake that they made in that quarter resulted in 7 points and kind of killed the entire mood of the game. But going back to what Jared said on the post-game show, like, UCLA is allowed to make plays. Oregon's allowed to, like, they're never going to play 100% perfect the entire way. No team is. Like, look at Georgia, like, against Alabama. Alabama came out and they just threw up like 28 points or something on Georgia. It looked like it was going to be just a blowout, just a huge game. And it turned into an all-time classic because it's really hard for any team to play perfect for 4 quarters. And it's really hard for good teams to play really poorly or to make a bunch of mistakes and not play to your level. Eventually, the averages kind of even out here. So, to answer the question, they did it against UCLA, and I know they had 7 points scored on them, but they were really, really good in that scenario. And one of those touchdowns probably is a benefactor of what happened a lot at the end of the first quarter for Oregon's offense, because I think they scored like on the first play, maybe the second play of the second quarter. I think it was a bomb to Tez Johnson that led to it, but it was a really good performance by Oregon, and one in which, like, if they did what they did in that second quarter against UCLA over 3 quarters against somebody, they would be talked about as the best team in the country, because at that point it's like they've scored almost 60 points and over 60 points, and they've had over 500 yards of offense through 3 quarters. Like, that was unbelievably good. And to be honest with you, like, I don't know how many more times this season Oregon's going to hold an opponent to negative yards in a quarter. I don't know how many times they're going to hold an opponent under like 30 the rest of the way. I mean, UCLA had 17 in the fourth quarter. If we want to look at that as another performance of, like, they were really good. Like, 17 total yards for UCLA. Oregon scored points in the fourth quarter. They had a 97, in that yards in that game. So I think this team has issues. Yes, they're not playing consistently. Is that a concern? I do think so. But at the same time, let's give a little bit of benefit of the doubt here to Oregon, because let's be real. Like, we knew this at the beginning of the season, that Oregon's schedule set itself up so that it was really soft through the first 5 weeks of the year. And whether like, hey, my job, it's really easy to get my work done for the first 6 months of the year, or if you've got an opponent and you look at the schedule and it's like, hey, like, first 5 weeks of this season, like, we don't have to give our best to find a way to win these games. Like, and then to expect the team every single week against a vastly inferior opponent every week to play at high level peak performance, that's really, really hard to do. The human element of letting up, not playing consistently to your best for 4 quarters will creep in at some point. And for the good teams, it's limiting how often that shows up. And I think in every game we've seen Oregon play on an elite level. It's just, it hasn't been for long stretches of time. And then long-winded answer here. Like, I think we're going to see a different team in 2 weeks against Ohio State, because that's really when the season starts for them. And it's really hard for 18 to 24-year-olds to bring their very best every single play of every single week when they know going in they're playing teams that are vastly inferior. That's hard to do.
Yeah. I added up the stats for the second half against Oregon State in the first half against UCLA. Oregon outscored them 55-10 in what would constitute 4 quarters there. Outgained them 623 to 145. So if you're, if you just take the best halves, the 2 best halves, which again were back to back, not in the same game, but a couple weeks apart, that's dominant enough. And then just a thought on Ohio State, and we'll talk about it more next week. I think right now would I pick Oregon to beat Ohio State? I think I'd back off and probably say I wouldn't, just because I haven't seen Oregon consistently play at its ceiling. I will say I still feel confident if Oregon plays an A+ game and Ohio State plays even maybe a B+ or an A- game, Oregon is very much capable of winning that game. I think Oregon has a ceiling that allows them to play with the very best teams in the country. The question is, can they get there? And I think what I have come away with through the first 4 weeks is I don't know if Oregon's A- or B+ game is capable of beating, like Ohio State's B- or C+ game. And I think that's the part where maybe I get a little bit concerned, which is I think this is a team that when they are playing their best, it looks awesome. And as I illustrated with those stats, as Matt did earlier with some of the numbers he ran through, they've had some great quarters, some great sequences so far. It just hasn't been consistent enough yet to feel like they're reaching their apex. But as you say, Matt, if this is a group that's motivated and focused and they put it all together against Ohio State, there's no doubt that they can play with that team and be competitive with that team and maybe pull out I think will now be an upset based upon where I expect that line to be. So we'll get more into Ohio State when that game comes game week, which is crazy because it's a week from now, Matt. A week from now, we'll be talking Ohio State, which is wild because it's finally here. But
4:30 kick, by the way. We got the kick time while we were recording this podcast. 4:30 NBC kick time. I'm just very, very thankful it's not a 7 p.m. game.
Gosh, yeah, I was worried it would be, but there's another only a 12-minute answer to that one, Matt. So we're really flying this morning. All right, we've got a third one here before we had a break from. Actually, Matt, let's just take a break since we've done 32 minutes. I'm guessing the second half is probably going to be a little bit shorter.
Okay. Let's take a quick break here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. All right, welcome back. 2 questions, 30 minutes in. Technically, you asked me a third question, so
You're right.
We gave a 6 question podcast, 3 questions in through 32 minutes. So we're only averaging just over 10 minutes, not like 15.
That's very charitable of you. My question of how was LA is included. All right. Third one does come from one of our OGs at Nash_Duckaneer, who asks, if Terrence Ferguson has to miss some game minutes, who do you think will be their third tight end to step up behind Patrick Herbert and Kenyon Sadiq? I think it will be Roger Saliapaga, but would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks, guys. #Autzen Audibles. Appreciate the question as always, Nash. I mean, this is the case. And I guess before we even jump into contingencies, Matt, what was it exactly that Dan said post-game about Terrence Ferguson and his status after he took that shot?
We think he's good. They held him out of precautionary reasons.
Okay.
In the second half.
So we will see if he misses time. I would imagine if you take a shot to the head and you don't play for the rest of the game, you're in concussion protocol, would be my guess, but I have no idea. And maybe he was, it's not a concussion. He's going to be trotting out of practice on Tuesday and everything's going to be hunky dory. But
so, I mean, I had the same thought, like initially when he came out and said what he said, and was like, ooh, he never once said what the injury was. You reported on Twitter, TV reported that it was a head injury, but Dan never said head injury. Dan never said anything. It was just, he's okay. We held him out in the second half out of precaution. We felt we were good. And to me, like, initially I was kind of like, we'll see. He didn't really say really anything. Mm-hmm. But then talking with a couple people post game and at the stadium and whatnot, I was like, what do we think of that answer? Do we believe him? Do we not believe him? And it was kind of mutually all brought up and agreed upon. Like, head injuries is like one thing that you just don't kind of dance around with.
Okay.
Because that creates really bad optics, like a misdiagnosing of concussion, and that could lead to other issues popping up. And so, like, if you come out and be like, "Hey, yeah, he's going to be good," and then the next week it's like, "Yeah, no, he's not good," that just causes concern. So part of me is kind of like now, almost kind of like, "Yeah, maybe he is good," because we all saw what happened. He got his bell rung. He got absolutely lit up by Brian Addison. And Dan probably knows we all saw it. And so I don't know. I kind of feel like he's going to be okay. Tuesday practice will be interesting to see if he's out there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we will have an answer on Tuesday. No Wednesday practice, by the way, this week. This is a short week, so if you're following our practice reports, you only see them on Tuesday. To answer the question here, let's assume for a moment that there is questions of Terrence Ferguson's health, and I think we still should have them going into the week. Even I think Matt brings up a good point here, where maybe he's going to be okay to play immediately, but if he's not, I agree with Nash. Roger Saliapaga would be the replacement, true freshman. He's played like 10 snaps, 12 snaps all season from scrimmage. He plays on a lot of special teams. He's the only true freshman to appear in all 4 games so far. This would be the name. I would also point out that Ferguson missed the entire second half, and Saliapaga didn't come in until like the backups came in at the very, very end. So I think in the interim, my guess is you'd see Herbert and Sadiq almost exclusively playing there. Or maybe with a week of prep and more ability to kind of incorporate him, you'd be able to find roles for Roger to be able to contribute. But I just know rewatching the game, I was tracking pretty closely in the second half to see, what was the contingency plan post Ferguson being knocked out. And it didn't seem like they used Saliapaga at all until the very, very end. So I would be just aware of that. That doesn't mean, again, like I said, if Ferg is out this week, they would have had a full week of planning to prepare for that and maybe find a way to get Roger involved, because I don't think you want to play Herbert and Sadiq only over the course of a game. But based upon what we saw on Saturday, that was what they did in the second half, at least. And, second half was kind of uneventful, so not a whole lot to take away from it. But that was what they did, at least.
So I got a different name to use here.
You're going to bring up Zach Grace?
Yes.
Our fullback?
It's the old school throwback player on this football team, Zach Grace. I think he traveled. I think that was very notable.
He was out there for 2 snaps, including a touchdown.
Yeah. So, I agree with you. It's predominantly going to be Herbert and Sadiq. And now the problem here is it's going to become very clear what happens if only one of them is on the field, and it's going to be a big tip of a play of probably what they're going to do. Herbert on the field, probably going to be a run. Sadiq on the field, probably going to be a pass. If both of them are out there, that makes it more up in the air of what it could be. But like you said, you can't play both the entire game. They're going to need a third guy. I think it's going to be Roger. And I also think we're going to see maybe a little bit of Zach out there as well in terms of playing. Zach's not all of a sudden going to see 18 snaps on the opposite side of the football, but it wouldn't surprise me if Ferguson can't go this week, that they maybe try and commit to running the football, and we see Herbert and Zach Grace out there at the same time with a little bit of, I formation football for Oregon, which is just really crazy and wild in today's day and age of football to think about.
Maybe they just go full house backfield the whole game. Amari Washington plays 46 offensive snaps as a lead blocker, and they just roll over everybody. Grace would be the other name to mention. I think he's a walk-on redshirt freshman. I think he would have played a little last year. He broke his arm midway through the season. But this is somebody that I know when we talked kind of about this exact topic and at the time it was who's number 4, because you had your 3. But Drew Maringer, Grace was one of the names along with Saliapaga and true freshman Caton or Catan. I don't know if we know how to pronounce that last name, but that was mentioned. Okay. Anything else on the tight ends? I don't know. I think this is one where we'll know more about the concern, or there won't be one tomorrow when we go to practice, and maybe even tonight. Yeah, because when Dan speaks this evening, maybe he'll be more forthcoming. You're right in terms of the head injury. I just the really easy kind of logic based upon what the broadcast said was that sounds like a concussion.
Yes.
But you're right in terms of what Dan said. Maybe illustrates if it was a precaution and not because he's in protocols. Maybe this is a guy we're actually going to see sooner than later, and maybe he won't miss any time in terms of this upcoming game. Okay, fourth question from @dweather5. Despite scoring 30-plus points in the last 3 games with touchdowns coming from basically every starter except the tight ends, good note there, why do you think the fan base is so upset with Will Stein, and do you believe they should be force-feeding Evan Stewart the ball more? Hashtag Autzen Audibles. And there's the question
Will
about
Stein hate's very weird to me.
There's a lot of it too. It's become the predominant thing, as if last year's offense wasn't awesome and this year's offense is just terrible and he needs to be, sent to the curb. Now, I understand when the offense isn't firing on all cylinders, who do you point to? And either it's the players or the coaches, and the coordinators are always the ones to get the finger pointed, first. I personally thought Will called a pretty freaking good game the last 2 weeks. Now, were there areas where I thought like, hey, they really relied on the screen game a lot, and we've kind of talked this one through in terms of why maybe they did that. I get that part. Like, there were a ton of screens. The second half was a screen fest, and frankly, a lot of those didn't work. And if you talk about why those drives, kind of didn't come together at points, like some of it was just kind of an over dependency maybe on just getting the ball out, but we should also know, like, early in the game, those are dynamic plays and they worked really well. So maybe a little UCLA credit for responding and changing some things up. So I guess I get a little of that. I don't have a great answer, Matt. Like, I guess I'm watching the games. I'm thinking the run game is not, and we talked about this already, the run game is not what we thought it would be, what we expected it to be. I don't think that's entirely on the offensive coordinator. In fact, I think if you rewatch the game, you notice they really ran primarily to the left on interior runs and primarily like outside to the right or the left on outside runs. And I think they were very intentional with where they were trying to run the ball. And for the most part, those seemed like pretty good choices. Like, I didn't think Jordan ran into too many like completely stacked boxes, it felt like. So I thought that part was okay. Do I wish they had runs of more than 16 yards? Yeah, that'd be really fun to watch. So I guess I get some of this to a certain degree, but the fan base is a lot more fired up about this than I am. And I don't know, like, do you agree or disagree? Or like, where are you at with this?
I think the Will Stein hate is very weird. I think the obsession over Evan Stewart touches is also strange. Like, what have we seen from Evan Stewart that says give him the ball more than Tez Johnson? Like, look at Tez Johnson's stat line and tell me why should he not be the focal point of the offense. This is kind of, unfortunately, like the nature of the beast of college athletics to a degree and recruiting to a degree. It's always something more shiny, better. Like, and I'll be 100% transparent here. Like, I thought Evan Stewart was going to be 1,000-yard receiver at Oregon.
He still might, Matt. He still very well could. There's a lot of season.
100%. And Tez Johnson's a perfect example of that because the first 5 games of the year for him last year didn't show a guy that was going to get there. And then he went off in the last, 8.
That's a good point.
And this year's team, they could play, 16 games if they go all the way through. But my bigger point is that, we see this all the time with, Jurrion Dickey, just showed up and, 5-star, instantly has to be this superstar elite dude and special talent. And Evan Stewart had big moments at Texas A&M. He was their best receiver. He's a former 5-star guy, but now he's playing in an offense that has as good, if not better, talent. Tez Johnson's a better player than he is. And look at Tez's production, and it's get the ball to Tez. That's your number one guy. Terrence Ferguson, prior to his injury, is on pace to have the best productive career ever at the position in program history. And think about Oregon is very quietly like a tight end U team, where they were a while ago. They had a run of like 7 straight starting tight ends getting their way into the NFL. They have a history there. So and Ferguson's on track still to be the best guy production wise in all of them. You still have Trayshawn Holden, who is a dude, and we've seen his explosive ability. Like, this is simply just, this is what you want out of an offense where, hey, we don't need to force feed the ball to 1 or 2 particular guys because they are above and beyond our best option. Let's present a game plan. Let's look at where this team is at, and then let's go to the points that are the weakest for the opponent. And for whatever reason, he did it against Boise, but Evan really hasn't been the guy that's landed in a position to be the focal point of the offense that week. It will happen. It'll change. There'll be games that
it's already happened. It's already happened. He had the Boise State game, right?
Yeah, where he'll get a ton of targets. They don't need to force feed the ball to Evan Stewart. Now, I have a question for you.
Okay.
What are our thoughts on the 2002 Oregon offense, and just in general terms? Like, did we look at them and say, like, hey, they were really good?
2022 or 2002?
22, sorry.
Okay. You said 2002. I was going, man, I have to think back. Was that like Joey Harrington? 2022 Oregon offense. Started off real slow with a shutout and then got a lot better. And by the end of the season, prior to Bo's injury, we're really humming. So I thought that was a good offense, but it wasn't an offense that like particularly started the season firing on all cylinders. And it was certainly not one where up until maybe the second half of that comeback against Washington State and Pullman, where you saw the prolific nature of the ability to like really put up big numbers against quality competition. Okay,
so that right there is what I was looking for. Like when they figured things out and they got to the middle of the season, towards the end of the year, we viewed them right as a prolific offense that could put up big numbers, right? Mm-hmm. So that team averaged 38 points per game in the country. They were 9th in the country in scoring, 38 points per game. Oregon's offense right now, yes, it's been inconsistent. Okay. They aren't even the top 25 in scoring, but they're averaging 36 points. That's 2 points less than what the 2022 offense did at Oregon. It's different offensive coordinators. You look at the 22 team and they were averaging 500 yards of offense, and Oregon is certainly not averaging 500 yards this season. They're averaging 50 yards less than that, 454. But the reality is they're not very far off from what they were producing from a team perspective from what they were in 2022. The Will Stein hate is mind-boggling to me. Last year, with a second-year QB in the system, 2 NFL talent receivers, a loaded offense, experienced offensive line, like they were unbelievably good on offense. And this year, they have a new center, they have a new quarterback, they have a new receiver, they have a new starting running back. They've had an injury up front along the offensive line. Things have not been smooth sailing as it was last year for the offense. There's just been a lot of new variables. Some of it was expected and some of it has not been. And it's not been as perfect as it was the previous year. But that's not to say that Stein is a really poor quarterback or offensive coordinator. I don't understand the hate. I don't understand the frustration. Like, yeah, maybe some screen calls were called a lot in that second half against UCLA, but it's very clear, like, up front, they're not running the ball as well as they wanted to. And the screen game is the extension of the run game. And they're basically just trying to figure out ways to quick hits. And Dan Lanning mentioned 3 times post game. Eventually, we are going to break some of these short pass plays into big gains. Like you can feel the frustration, you can hear the frustration. They know they're close. It's going to eventually happen. There's going to be a game where the screen game works perfectly and they just rip off huge gains and long touchdowns. And that's only going to create the, more success for the run game. So for me, like, I don't agree. I don't understand. It doesn't process in my head of why there's this Will Stein frustration, Will Stein hate with what's happening on offense.
Is it because Oregon has too many guys, like players that people think are good, and there's only one football? And so,
I mean, that goes back to like the Jay Harris stuff, where like all of a sudden there were expectations. Like, I agree with that though. Like, there's a lot of guys, and everyone, the fan base is thinking this isn't a video game. This isn't NCAA football 25 where you can have 3 receivers all have 1,000 yards, and your quarterback's going to throw for 6,000 yards, and like this isn't video game football. Like, guys are no matter how talented they are, guys are going to have dips in their production. And if it's a fear of, well, if this guy's not playing well, he's going to transfer. Like, who cares? In today's day and age, if they transfer, Oregon's good enough to go find someone else.
And the reason I asked that is because the specific part about Evan, which I saw asked numerous times, I saw it on our message board about how frustrated they were and how frustrated Evan must be. And to the question here, no, I don't want them force feeding the ball to really anybody. And, the suggestion that they're force feeding it to Tez, which is what I saw, it kind of becomes like a Tez versus Evan thing. Like Tez is open a lot. I know Evan's open a lot too. But for whatever reason, I don't think it's like playing favorites here for Dylan. I think in whatever situation they find themselves in, this is the open receiver. And it just so happens that Tez has been the guy that's been available a lot. And then I actually think, Matt, you brought up a good point there about how long it took to get Tez incorporated into the offense last year. And the same thing with Evan. These are guys, transfers, new to the system, going to have to get incorporated here. Through 5 games last year, Tez Johnson, 15 catches, 203 yards, 3 touchdowns. Yeah. Through 4 games this year, Evan Stewart, 14 catches, 162 yards, and a touchdown. Very similar numbers there. And then the flip side of that is that over the final 9 games of the season, Tez had over 900 yards. He had 7 touchdowns, and he had like 70 receptions. And I'm not saying Evan Stewart is going to do that, but there's kind of the playbook. There's the recipe for possibly seeing an uptick here for Evan, where people are like, because people are frustrated. This was one of the guys that we had several questions asked about. I mean,
he's tied for 3rd on the team in receptions, 1 behind the guy that's in number 2.
And part of this is because if you look at Evan, now the difference between, if you wanted to just be totally fair, the difference between Tez and Evan is through 5 games last year, or I should say through 4 games last year with Tez, he had at least 3 catches every game for at least 37 yards. Evan already has 3 games with less than 37 yards. He had the 112-yard game. So there have been, and the most recent game being a 3-catch, 9-yard game. I get that part of, in terms of like when he's not involved, he's like just not really there. But when he hasn't been involved, things have happened and clicked, which is probably why there's, I guess, a little bit of frustration. But I would say it's matchup related more than anything else. I don't think this is like them not trying to, I don't think they're like not scheming him into the offense on purpose.
And I also argue like we haven't seen the full arsenal yet of the playbook. Like,
oh, definitely not,
because they haven't had to show it yet. So like maybe a reason why we haven't seen a ton of Evan Stewart yet is simply because like, hey, everyone knows Tez Johnson's really good. Everyone kind of knows what Trayshawn Holden's, impact within this offense is. They were all here last year. Let's save Evan Stewart, and we're going to still run stuff for him, but let's save the really big stuff until we actually need to show it, because we don't need to show it right now. And I don't know if that's the case or not.
Yeah, but I'm not sure I totally buy that.
But the reality is that they've still been vanilla offensively. And when you're vanilla offensively, it makes you rely more on execution to make plays become explosive. And we've heard Dan Lanning now say, like, we need to get better at downfield blocking. We need to get better at perimeter blocking. And that's where a lot of Evan Stewart's targets have been at, the short game, screen game, and just that hasn't happened yet. So I'm not worried about any of it offensively, Evan Stewart or Will Stein.
Evan Stewart also, at least according to PFF, like an all-time bad perimeter blocker.
Yeah.
Not that necessarily means he shouldn't get the football, but maybe there's a little bit of no block, no rock kind of thing. If you go back and watch the game, there were a couple where it was pretty dicey. All right, fifth question from @RJ Duckface. Nico Reed played most, if not all, of the game and was targeted early and often. What's up with Dante Manning? How important is it to get Florence back if we want to make a playoff run? Hashtag Autzen Audibles. Yeah, this is where I pulled up the PFF does a snap count for every game. I know people disagree with their grades. I think their snap counts are pretty accurate. Why do I say that? University of Oregon uses their snap counts in their program, I've been told. So I think everybody's pretty agreed that this is at least good information. The snap count disparity, and this is going to surprise people. I know Matt kind of referenced earlier. It's actually basically even in this game. It was 30 for Nico Reed. It was 23 for Dante Manning. So they're still basically splitting these guys based upon the snap count numbers we saw there. And was Nico a liability? Maybe. He didn't play great, right? I think he was targeted more than anybody, which is only 4 times. He had the most receptions caught on him, 4 catches. He had the most yards allowed, 50 yards. Oregon also gave up 125 yards in this game, 13 completions. Isn't like they got absolutely sliced and diced, and it was just absolutely atrocious for Nico Reed. But I will bring up the point, and I thought it was a good one Matt brought up earlier, in the context of future competition, namely Ohio State and what they have outside. Yeah, I'm a little bit worried about what you have at corner with Nico, and to a lesser extent, maybe Dante. I think both those guys have played pretty darn well this year, but as we said earlier, they haven't really faced elite wide receiver competition. That will be changing. And I don't know what's going on with Jalil Florence. I have no answer to this. People bring this up all the time. It's very strange. Other than maybe this injury he's dealing with is a really, really long standing one, because it's been approximately 10 months since the injury, maybe 11 months since the injury. I think the first time he got hurt actually last year was in Seattle. He missed the second half there, or parts of the second half, and then kind of was in and out of the lineup, and then totally out of the lineup from Arizona State on. So this injury's been going on for a really long time. And again, it's really hard to get a sense of what's going on. I mean, there are days where it looks like he practices fully, and there are days that we arrive at the HTC 30 minutes before interviews are supposed to start, which coincide with the end of practice, and we see him walking around in short and T-shirts like he didn't practice or barely did anything. So I have no sense, to be totally honest, with what's going on with Jalil, and if he will be available in the short term, which I would be stunned if he's available versus Ohio State, or really much at all this season. So I don't have answers there. And I think it would be great to get him back, because his size would be a differentiator between Dante and Nico, who are both sub 6 feet, whereas Jalil is, I think, 6'1", 6'2". But I don't know if that's going to be an alternative option. So, anything else on corner that I'm missing?
I also think it's really strange Cam Alexander just does not play.
Yes,
we penciled him in as potential starter, and he just doesn't see the field really at all. I mean, 2 games I think he's played in?
Yeah, let me get you a season snap count in a second.
It's very low. And is that because they decided that Dante Manning and Nico Reed are better players because they've been in the system, they've just developed, they've gotten better? Did an injury impact things for Cam Alexander? What has happened there? But it's all of a sudden you combine Florence's injury, not practicing, not being available, plus Cam Alexander just not being good enough to play, apparently. All of a sudden, a cornerback room that we felt like, hey, they have a bunch of options, now doesn't have a ton from a productive level. Roderick Pleasant and Dalen Austin are both still there. Both guys traveled to UCLA. I think they've played in games, but they don't play nearly as much as the other group. But it is interesting. And I am a little concerned about what's going to happen against Ohio State. Now, thankfully for Oregon, after Ohio State, they don't really face anybody on the schedule that's going to have the talent at receiver. Now, Washington's got some guys. Their offense is actually sneaky,
kind of interesting.
Yeah, from a receiver perspective, and Denzel Boston, I'm going to pull this up really quickly. Like his receiving stats are just crazy. And he's second in the country in touchdown catches with 7. He is all of a sudden turned into like their next big thing at the position. Giles Jackson is certainly a productive guy as well. But maybe outside of Washington, like I can't really think of anybody on the schedule. Wisconsin's not going to be a pass heavy team.
Illinois on the outside with Pat Bryant and Zachary Franklin.
Yes.
That's pretty decent.
And Altmaier at quarterback has actually been really, really, really good.
Yeah.
So they have like 2 other teams that you're like looking at and saying like, oh, like they've got some talent there, but it's just, can you come down to from a concern issue? Like, can you get by 3 games?
And I'll be honest, this Friday, we haven't talked at all about Michigan State. Aiden Childs has undoubtedly the most live arm of any quarterback Oregon will face to this point and maybe in the season. Now, that live arm tends to throw the ball to the wrong team and not to the right players very often based upon his stats. And what I've watched, 8 interceptions through his first 5 games. But this guy has an NFL arm talent. And at receiver, they've got a couple of guys that are at least respectable that can get open and will challenge you on the outside. They have a true freshman who is like 6'3", who's leading the team in receiving, had a huge game against Maryland. So we'll see about them being in that category. I just wanted to bring them up because we haven't talked to Michigan State at all, and the next team actually will try to test you through the air as much as they can. Do I think they'll have as much success as some of the teams we just brought up? Absolutely not. And some of that has to do with quarterback, where I'm just not 100% sure he's going to be accurate enough. But that's certainly just a storyline to be looking at this week is maybe Michigan State can provide some challenges and some tests that will get you at least aware of where Oregon's cornerback situation is at. Snap counts for the season at corner were kind of interesting. I was just looking at this. Jabbar Muhammad, 209 snaps. Second on the team. Kobe Savage leads with 228. So that gives you a sense that Jabbar is basically on the field for every down of consequence. Brandon Johnson plays in the slot, so I won't use him, but he's played 185. Nico Reed, 145. Dante Manning, 121. So those guys are really evenly splitting that. And then Dalen Austin has played 27 snaps this season. And Cam Alexander's played 8.
Wow.
Sorry, I had that wrong. I was looking at the wrong. Dalen Austin has 19 snaps, so a little bit less. So those guys aren't. Roderick Pleasant, according to this, hasn't played at all. So in terms of I still think there's a lot of talented players in this room, but I absolutely think it's worth bringing up the concerns going into some of these bigger games with talented receivers, because you could certainly argue that this is an area where it's not the biggest of their strengths, and we'll see how they stack up, especially against the elite guys at Ohio State. Frankly, the names we brought up of other guys, like you kind of just they're not anywhere near as good as Ohio State is, I guess.
No one is. No one on Oregon's schedule will have anything close to what Ohio State will have. Ohio State has like 3 legitimate number 1 receivers on their team, or they severely have 2, and their number 3 could probably be number 2 for most Big Ten teams.
Well, and maybe number 1 for a lot. And the reality is that if you thought Riley Williams was awesome for Alabama, boy, did I love watching some of those plays. I didn't get to catch that fourth quarter until after Oregon UCLA wrapped, but Jeremiah Smith was seen as the superior prospect and is rated and graded out as like one of the most talented true freshman receivers we've seen. This guy came in and is now, I think, leading Ohio State in receiving as a true freshman on a roster that also features Emeka Egbuka.
Yep. So, like, I look at this and think Ohio State's going to be a concern, but after that, they should still be able to get by things. And to your point about Aiden Childs, like, I agree. Live arm, really talented arm strength, but he's not good. He's like 93rd in the country in QBR rating.
Makes a ton of mistakes.
Yes. Has 8 interceptions. Is not working. Now, whether that's because lack of talent around him, his issues, combining of both, what have you. But what we will see is him test Oregon's DBs. He will throw the ball deep. He will throw it up in the air. they will give the opportunity for Oregon's players to make a chance at the ball, and we'll just see if they respond to it or not.
Yeah, and the Childs thing, and we'll talk way more about him over the course of this week, but the reality is this is a rare arm talent right here. This is a guy who's going to throw the ball, and a couple times you're going to be like, oh man, how did he fit it in there? How did he get the ball down the seam with that much ease? It's a matter of, does he make the kind of mistakes? Does he have the Ethan Garber's moments, which we saw on full display last game, where it was like just a couple of those were like, oh my gosh. And if you go watch what Childs has done this season, he's had a lot of them. So that's a player who I still think is going to be really good down the line. But right now he's working out the kinks. And I would be really surprised if we come out of Friday's game going like, oh my gosh, Aiden Childs arrived. And if he does have a game like that, that probably means that game's a lot more competitive than we are expecting it will be.
All right, that's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you for submitting your questions. Thank you for getting through this hour-long podcast. It's really surprising. How did we get here?
I don't know, man. Well, it was a 25-minute first answer, so probably that.
But that's going to do it for us. We'll be back later this week with more podcast previewing and getting you ready for this Friday night's game at home against Michigan State. But until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.